going to move to the last talk in this session, which will be presented by Steve Schwering from the University of Wisconsin-Madison. So Steve, over to you.
All right, so throughout today's presentations, we've heard a lot about how reading supports literacy and other language abilities. My talk today is going to be looking at quite a different perspective. We're going to be considering how reading supports a very different skill within the social domain, and that skill is emotion recognition. So if literacy benefits the reader beyond reading, we need a pathway to establish how this happens. And here is one potential pathway. So throughout this talk, we'll be considering how reading impacts the statistical regularities or an individual's statistical experiences with emotion words, which we believe in turn impact emotion recognition skills. And previous research suggests that statistical experience with words, in particular access to category labels, reinforces concepts. So for example, Lupin et al. Demonstrated that access to a category label supported later categorization of novel members of that category. In this specific example, they were training people on categories of aliens, and people had to label those. In the emotion domain, access to a label for a novel emotion makes later recognition of that emotion faster and more accurate, solidifying those emotion concepts. So in this talk, we're going to be considering how statistical experience with emotion words affects emotion concepts. And I'll be presenting a set of studies from a recent paper that we published exploring the relationship between fiction reading and emotion recognition, published in Effective Science. So if you'd like a copy of that paper, feel free to send me an email and I can get that to you. All right, so now let's turn to defining how reading impacts statistical experience with emotion words. To do that, we need to look at books that people typically read and examine how emotions are expressed in those books. So in the example on the left, right, we have the text, Lola loves Tuesdays. On Tuesdays, Lola and her mommy go to the library. We're particularly interested in examining how emotion category labels are used, like the word love here. And if we can go ahead and collect a series of these examples from across many books, then we can go ahead and start to characterize how emotion words are used in context and see if that impacts people's emotion recognition behaviors. So I'll be presenting first a set of corpus analyses, which are going to help us answer this question, right? How are emotion words used in fiction, and how are they used in comparison in other kinds of language? Then I'll be presenting two sets of behavioral data, trying to link these statistics that we've measured in our corpus analyses and try and understand how those statistics impact emotion recognition. So answering the question of, does reading fiction predict emotion recognition abilities? Okay, first we're going to start by talking about these corpus analyses. Okay, so we're going to be focusing on a corpus of adult language use in particular, and all of the corpus analyses and behavioral data will be oriented towards adults. So I'd love to talk about developmentally oriented questions as we move into the discussion, but just keep that in mind while we're talking about this. Okay, so we're looking at the corpus of contemporary American English, which contains a variety of different genres of language. Contains fiction language, spoken language, as well as an array of other languages that we are categorizing in this other category. The corpus of contemporary American English is rather large. It contains, it contained at the time of our analyses, over 560 million words, and it's continually growing. So we split this corpus up into three different corpus genre categories that we wanted to analyze. The first was fiction, which contained fiction, short stories from fiction journals, short stories themselves, first chapters of fiction books, etc. Our spoken language category contained text from radio programs, reality television shows, as well as some transcriptions of natural conversations. And our other category was just a grab bag of the rest of the corpus. It contained newspapers, academic journals, popular magazines, and some more. Okay, so given this corpus, we went and we wanted to examine how emotion words are used in the corpus. And we extracted the following emotion words, which we divided into two separate categories that were interesting from the perspective of emotion researchers. So our first category are these simple emotions: anger, disgust, fear, joy, surprise, and sadness. And these simple emotions are often called basic emotions or universal emotions. They're relatively easy for people to recognize, and they're thought to be recognizable for all people across all societies. And the ability to recognize them develops early, or some theories even suggest is innate. These complex emotions are a little bit more difficult for people to recognize, and they're often thought to be combinations of these simple emotions. So we were really interested in understanding if different kinds of texts treated these different kinds of emotions in different ways. So we split them up and analyzed how they were used separately. So we extracted all lemmas of these emotion category labels and their surrounding 5-token context to examine how the words were used in context. We got a few 100,000 examples out of this, and we analyzed 20,000, approximately 5% of that entire sample, randomly sampled. Okay, so what do I mean by we analyzed those words in context? So we had human raters, research assistants, judge whether the emotion words were used in an emotive sense or not. So, for example, an emotive sense of the word relief would be an example like this. She gave a sigh of relief that the hurricane was over, right? It's expressing somebody's feelings about a current state of events, about their internal emotional state. A non-emotive sense, on the other hand, would be something like the following: the Hurricane Relief Fund grew exponentially after the news story, right? It's not expressing a person's internal emotional state, it's expressing some other sense of that specific word. If we look at another example, right, the word interested, right, he was interested in the developing news story, it's expressing somebody's fascination with this event. But you could also be expressing a monetary sense of the word interest, right? The account accrued interest over time. Okay, so we had research assistants rate whether the words were used in an emotive sense or not. And we examined how the use of these words in an emotive sense was distributed over the various genres of the corpus that we analyzed. So we examined the proportion of times that these emotion words were used in an emotive sense in fiction, other language than spoken, split up by whether the words were categorized as simple or complex. So let's first look at the simple emotion category labels. Based on the relative size of this purple bar, right, we could see that the simple emotion words were used in an emotive sense predominantly across all of our corpus genres, so fiction, other, and spoken language. But this contrasts quite strongly with our complex emotion category labels, which are used in an emotive sense predominantly in fiction texts, but not in other corpus genres. Okay. So, which leads us to draw a conclusion, right, that fiction reading shapes the statistical experiences with these emotion category labels. And in particular, that fiction may be a unique source of complex emotion information. So by reading fiction texts, an individual may be experiencing certain kinds of emotions more often in an emotive sense than other kinds of emotions. And in particular, these complex emotions are being informed by reading fiction. But this doesn't answer the question of whether reading and a person's experience with reading fiction impacts their emotion recognition abilities. So what we're trying to understand with our next two behavioral studies is whether reading fiction supports complex emotion recognition. And if it does, right, we might expect that individuals who read fiction should be particularly good at recognizing complex emotions because they've encountered those complex emotions more frequently in an emotive sense. Okay. So to try and understand how a person's reading experiences impact their emotion recognition abilities, we need different measures to measure their reading experiences and a measure to recognize, to measure their emotion recognition abilities. So to measure a person's experiences with reading fiction texts, we employed the author recognition task, which has been employed by a number of different researchers and has developed over the years to include more and more recent authors. In the example here, in the author recognition task, an individual needs to identify real authors and reject non-author names. So in this example provided, where a person might see these 4 names, they would need to correctly click on J.R.R. Tolkien and identify them as a real author over the non-authors. Now, the thought behind this task is that individuals who have read more fiction should be able to better identify real authors and reject non-authors. So individuals who have read more should presumably score higher or score better on this author recognition task than somebody who has read less. This was largely based on the Western canon, Western authors, given our sample. So to measure a person's emotion recognition abilities, we employed the Geneva emotion recognition task, which is a task where participants see a series of actors expressing emotions, and they need to click on or identify the emotion that the actor is trying to convey. So the videos of actors are probably like 3 or 4 seconds long. Individuals see their body language, their shoulders may be slumping, they see their facial expression. They also get some short vocalization from the actor. No words are produced, but it's just a short vocalization like or individual needs to click on which emotion is being expressed. So for example, if this video would be playing, you would see that this person was expressing disgust. Great. So as I mentioned, we're particularly interested in linking these corpus analyses to our behavioral data. So if fiction is a unique source of complex emotion information, then we would expect people who have read more fiction to score better on this emotion recognition task. So on our x-axis, we have our ART scores. The more we're going to the right, the higher the ART score, the more a person has read fiction. On the y-axis, we're showing the proportion of correct responses in the GERT task. So again, a higher score indicates better responses. And as I mentioned, right, does reading support complex emotion recognition? So first, we're going to look at our simple recognition of simple emotions. And we can see that as ART score is increasing, participants are not getting any better at recognizing these simple emotions. The line represents a trend line estimated from the data. Each dot represents a participant's average score. But when looking at complex emotions, we get a slightly different picture, right? So as ART score is increasing, participants are getting better and better at recognizing these complex emotions, right? Which neatly parallels our corpus analyses, suggesting that perhaps this complex emotion information is being supported by fiction reading. This sample was collected from the University of Wisconsin-Madison undergraduates. They're all college-age students. All of them are native speakers of English. So keep that in mind when interpreting this sample.
Steve, you've got a couple of minutes left.
Okay, great. I'm almost done. All right, so what this data suggests, right, is that fiction reading may be supporting complex emotion recognition. But as I mentioned, right, we collected this sample from UW-Madison undergraduate students. And the question remains, right, do these results generalize outside of college-age adults? And we were particularly interested in analyzing across the population of the United States, given our corpus analyses, as well as the sample that we had access to. Okay, so we went and collected a replication of this first study using 400 mechanical Turk participants. We restricted the age ranges to be between 18 and 25. All participants were from the US and all were native speakers of English again. And interestingly, we were able to replicate that initial finding with are complex emotions. Participants with higher ART scores were better able to recognize those complex emotions, which paralleled experiment 1. But we found a similar effect in our simple emotions, right? So we didn't get this flat line anymore. There was an increase with simple emotion recognition with ART score. Which may suggest something slightly different, right? It seems that overall participants are, with higher ART scores, are better able to recognize all emotions. Okay, so what conclusions can we draw? So from our corpus analyses, we are seeing that fiction may be a unique source of complex emotion information. And from our 2 behavioral studies, we're getting that fiction reading supports emotion recognition and perhaps complex emotions especially, but with a caveat that that specific effect of complex emotions may or may not be reliable in the larger sample. Okay, so that's the basis of what I wanted to talk about. I'd really love to talk about some extensions to children's literature in the developmental domain. I think there are some really great questions to be thinking about regarding cultural differences in how emotions are expressed and understood, and how that may be represented or captured in the language that people use. I'd also really love to think about these questions about complementary verbal and visual information, especially with respect to children's books. So for example, on the right, you can see that really beautiful illustration of the child's expression, which may be mutually informative of the textual information that a child is receiving while they're reading. So that's everything I have, and thanks for listening.
Thank you very much for a very interesting talk. So again, the audience can use the Q&A box to ask questions, and while we're waiting for people to ask questions, I just want to say, it seems like you got a really kind of simple but rich paradigm to kind of examine the relationship between reading experiences and emotion recognition. But I guess I'd be a bit curious, what do you think in terms of other kinds of factors that have nothing to do with fiction reading might be influencing emotion recognition? So I unfortunately haven't read your paper, so maybe you've addressed this already. So would you want to say a few things about that?
Absolutely. So part of what we, so there are a lot of third variables that could account for this, right? Age is a particularly great one. So individuals who are older may be more sensitive to recognizing emotions in other individuals, but they've also read a lot more and maybe just more familiar with these kinds of texts. It could also be the case that we have participants who have read more may also be just more interested in recognizing the emotional states of others. And that may be informative of their emotion recognition abilities. Some of these third variables may be driving our differences between experiments 1 and 2. Our sample from a larger population could mean even that the ART, the author recognition task, is measuring different things between these 2 groups. You know, there's also some really interesting perspectives from the emotion literature. One of the possible alternative explanations that is commonly represented in theoretical work in the emotion literature is that individuals who are reading fiction are simulating the emotional states of others. Part of what we're proposing here is that the statistical information, your encounters with words in context, are with these emotion category labels in context, is influencing your semantic representation of these words. But it could be the case that people are engaging with fiction texts in very different ways than with spoken language, with news, with academic texts, and so on. So I think looking into the causal mechanisms are going to be really interesting. Perhaps that could come from manipulating statistical experiences while controlling the event information in the text, or even doing more causal manipulations in the first place. You're giving people books to read and seeing how that influences their emotion recognition abilities. But I think those are all great stuff for future research to do, and yeah, would greatly advance the theory.